The first time Kendrick Stokes was arrested, he was 12. It was a mistake. His, theirs, everyone's. A case of wrong place, wrong time, wrong skin. He spent a night in a cell, silent, his legs too short to reach the bench. His mother picked him up the next morning with a look that was half exhaustion, half warning. "You got lucky this time, Kendrick. Stay out of trouble." He had, but tonight he was 15, and he was not lucky. The courtroom was indifferent to the weight of his words. The air was thick with routine, paper shuffling, murmured conversations, the dull tap of a judge's gavel against polished wood. Just another case, just another boy lost in the system. That was how it was supposed to go. Then Kendrick spoke. "The cops beat me." The words landed like a slap, silencing the quiet hum of procedure. For a moment, the courtroom held its breath. Judge Marianne Dunham, who had heard 1,000 denials and 1,000 lies, studied him. Her fingers, lined with age and experience, rested near her gavel, but she did not move to use it. She watched him. That was the first thing that was different. Across the room, Officer Brent Callowell, the man who had arrested him, shifted in his seat. Not much, just enough. His jaw tightened, his eyes flickered, but he said nothing. Kendrick's guardian, Miss Bernice Lowry, inhaled sharply beside him. She had warned him against this. "Do not make trouble where there is already enough of it, Kendrick." But now her grip tightened on the edge of her seat, her knuckles white. The Assistant District Attorney Dana Hollowell set her pen down, deliberately. Until now, Kendrick had been another case file, a name attached to a charge. But something in the way he spoke made her pause. "Kendrick," Judge Dunham said, her voice measured, "repeat that." Kendrick's small hands curled into fists against the Eva ice, worn wooden table. His knuckles ached, but his voice did not waver. "The cops beat me." A throat cleared somewhere in the back. Someone shifted uncomfortably. The weight of his words settled over the room, thick and suffocating. Miss Hollowell frowned. "There is no mention of excessive force in the reports." Of course there was not. The defense attorney, a man with silver at his temples, leaned forward. "Your Honor, these are serious accusations. If the boy—" "Overruled," Judge Dunham said immediately. She was still watching Kendrick, because something told her this was just the beginning. It had been a shortcut home. 2 blocks, a familiar alley, nothing new. The red and blue lights flashed behind him, and Kendrick stopped. Hands out of his pockets, chin up, heart pounding. He had learned early that movement could be mistaken for guilt. Officer Callowell stepped out first. His partner, Riley Denton, taller and older, stood just behind. "Hey, kid," Callowell said, like they were old friends. "Where are you coming from?" "Home." A lie. A small one. The kind that kept DeAndre's mother from waking up to a nightmare. Callowell smiled, but it was not kind. "What's in your pockets?" "Nothing." "You mind if we check?" "Yes," but that did not matter. Kendrick took a step back. "I didn't do anything." Denton exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "See? I don't like that." Like Kendrick had personally offended him. "I don't like when they act like that. Like that." The words made Kendrick's stomach tighten. Then Callowell grabbed his wrist. It was not a question, not a request. Instinct took over before he could stop it. A yank, a flinch, just enough to show fear, not fight. But it did not matter. Denton shoved him against the wall. Stop resisting. I'm not. A fist to the ribs. Pain exploded through his side, sharp and sudden, sucking the air from his lungs. He folded. You're lucky we're in a good mood tonight, Callowell muttered. And then the cuffs. Kendrick had not known what he was being arrested for. He was not sure if they did either. But he remembered what Denton had said before the cruiser door slammed shut. You can say whatever you want, kid. End of the day, your word doesn't mean a damn thing against ours. Why did you not report this earlier? The defense attorney's voice was smooth, practiced. Kendrick looked at him, then at Callowell. They told me no one would believe me. Callowell did not flinch. He did not need to. The courtroom was too used to stories like Kendrick's. That was how this worked. The people who did things like this counted on kids like him to stay quiet. Hollowell exhaled. Your Honor, I request access to all available body cam footage from the night of Kendrick's arrest. A shift. A flicker of something across Callowell's face. Gone in an instant. Judge Dunham nodded. Motion granted. Kendrick's stomach clenched. He did not know what the footage would show. If the cameras had been rolling, if they had accidentally malfunctioned the way they sometimes did. But if the footage was missing, that would say more than anything he could. The room held its breath. Then Hollowell's aide whispered something in her ear. She straightened. Your Honor, she said carefully, according to department logs, Officer Callowell's body cam footage from that night is missing. A voice came from the back of the courtroom. I saw what happened. Every head turned. A man stood near the entrance, mid-40s, dark skin, tired eyes. He hesitated. Then he looked at Kendrick. Then at the judge. I was there that night, he said. I saw the cops stop that boy. And I saw what they did. They tried to discredit him, a bystander, a man off the street. What proof did he have? His cell phone was pinged near the scene, Hollowell's aide confirmed. And additional dashcam footage places him there. Silence. Real, heavy silence. The judge turned to Callowell. Officer Callowell, do you have anything to say? His jaw tightened. His lawyer whispered something. Damage control, spin the narrative, discredit the witness. But Callowell did not answer, because there was nothing left to say. The charges against Mr. Stokes are dismissed. The words should have felt like victory, but Kendrick knew better. This was not justice. This was survival. Callowell was under investigation now. That meant hearings, scrutiny, the kind of attention officers like him were not used to. Maybe he would be suspended. Maybe he would not. Maybe it would be swept under paperwork and silence. But Kendrick had made them listen, and for now, that was enough. He turned to leave. One last glance at Callowell. The officer did not look at him, because today, Kendrick had won. And that changed everything. As Kendrick stepped out of the courtroom, the world outside felt different. The same cold March air, the same distant sounds of traffic. But something had shifted. Miss Lowry walked beside him, silent at first. She had been his guardian. Since his mother passed 2 years ago, a hard woman, weary in a way that made Kendrick wonder if life had ever been kind to her. She had spent weeks telling him to keep his head down, to let the system do what it would do. But now, outside the courthouse, she finally spoke. You were brave in there. Kendrick kept his hands in his pockets. Didn't feel like it. Brave ain't got nothing to do with how you feel, Kendrick. It's what you do, anyway. They crossed the parking lot. Hollowell was still inside, discussing next steps. The press hadn't picked up the case, at least not yet. Maybe it wouldn't. Maybe Callowell would get reassigned. Maybe he'd keep his job. Maybe he'd make someone else feel the way Kendrick felt that night. He stopped walking. Miss Lowry turned, eyebrows raised. "That's it?" Kendrick asked. His voice was quiet, but it carried. "I just go home?" She sighed. But it wasn't impatience. More like she had been waiting for the question. "What else do you think should happen?" He didn't know. Miss Lowry softened. "You did what you could, Kendrick. More than most. That's all anybody can do." He didn't answer, because it wasn't enough. 2 weeks passed. School started again. Kids whispered. Teachers looked at him like they wanted to say something but didn't know how. DeAndre was the only one who asked. What happens to him now? They were sitting on the steps of DeAndre's building, legs stretched out onto the cracked sidewalk. "Callowell?" Kendrick asked. "Yeah." "He getting locked up?" Kendrick let out a breath through his nose. "No." DeAndre kicked at a loose piece of pavement. "So what's stopping him from doing it again?" That was the thing. Nothing. 1 month later, Callowell was still on duty. The investigation was ongoing. A process Kendrick didn't fully understand. A process that was meant to take time, to wear people down until they stopped paying attention. That was how the system worked, and it might have worked on Kendrick too. But then he saw Reggie Samuels again. It was late. Too late to be out. But Kendrick wasn't doing anything wrong, just walking home, like that night. Except this time, he wasn't afraid. Not in the same way. He was passing the corner store when he spotted Reggie across the street. The man had his hands in his pockets, shoulders hunched like he was carrying something too heavy. Kendrick hesitated. Then, without fully thinking about it, he crossed. Reggie noticed him when he was halfway there. His eyes were tired, but aware. "Didn't expect to see you out here, kid." Kendrick shrugged. "Didn't expect to see you in court." Reggie let out a dry chuckle. "Neither did I." A car passed. The neon light from the store flickered against the pavement. "Why did you?" Kendrick asked finally. Reggie exhaled. A long, deep breath. "Because I saw what they did to you." Kendrick waited. Reggie shifted, looking at something in the distance. "And because I saw what they did to me." Kendrick frowned. "What do you mean?" A pause. Then, "I was your age when it happened to me. Not the exact same way, but close enough. Difference is, no one listened back then." Kendrick studied him. Reggie shook his head. "I didn't say anything. Not like you. I just kept my head down, went home, tried to move on, thought that was the best thing to do." He finally met Kendrick's eyes. "But you—" He gave a small, tired smile. "You made them listen." The weight of those words sat between them. Then Reggie sighed. "Look, kid, I don't know what happens next, but I do know one thing." Kendrick waited. Reggie's voice was quieter now. "They don't stop unless we make them." The words stuck. They followed Kendrick home. They sat with him in the quiet of his room. They settled deep, where thoughts turned into decisions. They don't stop unless we make them. The next day, Kendrick made a decision. He didn't know exactly how change happened. He didn't think anyone did. But he knew this much. If he stopped talking, if he stopped pushing, then everything that happened in that courtroom would be for nothing. So he kept talking, first to DeAndre, then to Miss Lowry, then to the other kids in his school, the ones who knew exactly what it felt like to cross the street at the wrong time and feel a cop car slow down beside them. Word spread. Not in headlines, not in news reports, but in the way people started watching Callowell differently. In the way Kendrick's teachers, some of them, stopped avoiding the subject and started asking questions. In the way people, for the first time, stopped pretending it wasn't happening. Months later, Callowell resigned. It wasn't an arrest. It wasn't justice, not really. But it was something. A crack in the wall. A sign that maybe, just maybe, people weren't looking away anymore. Kendrick knew this wasn't the end. For every case like his, there were 100 more that never made it this far. Kids who never got to speak. Cases that never made it to a courtroom. But this time, someone listened. And that meant maybe, next time, someone else would too. And maybe, just maybe, that was how things changed. 1 year later, Kendrick stood outside the courthouse, the air thick with the heat of summer. The stone steps beneath him radiated warmth, but inside, his chest felt cold. He had been here before. He had sat in that same stiff-backed chair, in that same sterile courtroom, with the weight of other people's judgments pressing down on him. Only this time, it was not his case. This time, he was here for someone else. Miss Lowry had not liked it. "You already got through this once, Kendrick," she had told him that morning. "You don't need to go digging it up again." But Kendrick had not let it go, and neither had Reggie. Because after Callowell resigned, something became clear. Kendrick's case was not the only one. There were other kids, other men, other families who had stories that had never made it to a courtroom. And now, with the right people watching, some of those cases were finally being reopened. This one belonged to a boy named Jalen Green. 15 years old. Arrested last summer for loitering, except he had not been loitering. He had been standing outside his own apartment building. Same story, different name. And today, Kendrick was here to testify. Not because he was a lawyer, not because he had any power over the system, but because he knew. He knew what it felt like to sit in that chair, to have your whole life condensed into the words of strangers who had already made up their minds about you. He knew what it meant to have someone believe you, and he was not going to let Jalen sit in that courtroom alone. Inside, the case was dragging on. The defense attorney, different man, same polished suit, same dismissive tone, was arguing that Jalen had been uncooperative. That word, uncooperative. Kendrick hated it. It was a word that made it sound like Jalen had chosen this, like he had invited the rough hands, the bruises, the fear. Like saying no to something you never should have had to agree to was the real crime. The prosecution was better than before. They were asking the right questions, pressing the right details. But Kendrick could see the way Jalen kept looking down, at his hands, shoulders tight, shrinking. He had sat like that once, too. When it was finally his turn to take the stand, Kendrick exhaled slowly. He met Jalen's eyes as he passed. A small nod. Jalen's fingers uncurled slightly. Kendrick sat. The defense attorney straightened, looking at him with the same measured skepticism Kendrick had seen in so many faces before. "Mr. Stokes," the attorney began, "you testified in a similar case last year, correct?" "Yes." "And that case led to an officer's resignation?" "Yes," the attorney nodded, flipping through his notes. "So you would say you have a personal interest in cases like these?" Kendrick met his eyes. "I have an interest in the truth." The man exhaled sharply, like he was trying not to smirk. Mr. Stokes, you were not present during Jalen Green's arrest, were you? No. And yet, you believe you can speak to the events of that night? Kendrick leaned forward slightly. I can speak to what it feels like, he said. His voice was steady. I can speak to what happens when officers think no one will listen, when they think no one will believe a kid over them. The courtroom was silent. The attorney shifted, straightening his tie. That is a compelling sentiment, Mr. Stokes. But we deal in facts here, not feelings. Kendrick tilted his head slightly. The fact is, he said, you wouldn't be questioning me like this if what happened to me hadn't been real. That shut him up. The prosecution took over after that. Kendrick answered their questions honestly, carefully. He knew his testimony alone wouldn't decide the case. He wasn't naive, but he knew that people were listening, and that was enough. Outside, Kendrick stood on the steps, letting the heat sink into his skin. He didn't know what would happen with Jalen's case. Not yet. But he knew this. It wasn't stopping here. He had spent so much of his life being told to let things go, that it was safer to be quiet, that the system would do what it did, and people like him would just have to deal with it. But silence was what let things keep happening. And Kendrick was done being silent. Hey! He turned. Jalen was standing at the top of the steps, his posture still tense, but his eyes more alert than before. You really think this is going to change anything? Kendrick considered that for a moment. Then he nodded. Maybe not everything, he admitted, but something. Jalen exhaled, glancing down at the street below. After a moment, he nodded back. Then he turned and walked away. And Kendrick knew, really knew, that this was not the end, just the beginning.